What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Cosmic Wonder. I'm your host, Warren Thompson, and we finally have our very first episode of Moon Knight. Moon Knight, Stephen Grant, and Marc Spector are now officially introduced into the MCU. And I'm going to break down this very first episode for you, telling you everything you need to know about Stephen Grant, Marc Spector, Moon Knight, and the villain, Arthur, what he's up to, what are his master plans, and what is in store for Moon Knight. There's a lot to break down, so let's dive right into it. But of course, if you're new, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the latest Marvel news. So, Moon Knight, episode 1 starts off with a black screen. But we hear music over the black screen, which is the song Every Grain of Sand by Bob Dylan. We then see a person who is doing some type of ritual. They never show this person's face, but they do show him with long hair and a staff walking away. Now, of course, later on in the episode, we find out that this is Ethan Hawke's character, Arthur Harrow, and he seems to be doing some sort of a ritual. Now, in this episode, we learn a little bit about the MCU's Arthur Harrow, who doesn't seem to really be like his character in the comics. In fact, Arthur Harrow in the comics isn't even that big of a Moon Knight villain. Arthur Harrow was a talented surgeon and scientist whose work in medicine and pain treatment led to him being nominated for a Nobel Prize. However, a person by the name of Dr. Victoria Grail became a little bit suspicious on how his work advanced, since his research paper said that he only carried out limited research done on animals. However, she linked him back to performing secret experiments at Auschwitz-Birkenau, a famous concentration camp from real life. Arthur, of course, wants to continue his experiments, and Dr. Victoria Grail wants to stop him. His men almost kidnap her, but Moon Knight interferes and saves her. The two of them then go to his lab to try and stop him, but he ends up getting away, and that's pretty much all the interaction they had. So as you can see from this episode, they have clearly changed who this person is from the comics, which is actually something Ethan Hawke said attracted him to this character. It was so new, and everything is so detached from the MCU. There aren't really that many connections being made, at least in the first few episodes. But there are some really important things to notice in this opening scene. Now, Ethan Hawke said that he came up with this ritual idea himself. He said he was always hypnotized by deeply spiritual people who were self-lacerating. And in this scene here, that's what we see him do. As a deeply spiritual person, cult leader, and follower of the goddess Ammit, he himself is self-lacerating when we see him crush up the glass, put the glass in his shoes, and walks on them. But two major important things here. Take a look at the staff that he has. It has two crocodile heads on it, and Ammit's head is a crocodile head. Now, we do know that he uses this staff to judge people on behalf of Ammit using her powers. So he was most likely given this staff by Ammit herself, or he found it in her tomb somewhere. We'll have to wait and see on that. However, it goes with the tattoo on his arm, which is a scale. Now, this scale is an ancient Egyptian scale used by the god Anubis during what was called the weighing of the heart. Anubis was the ancient Egyptian god of the dead, and the weighing of somebody's heart would judge their fate. Anubis would put the heart of the deceased person on the scale and a feather on the other side, which represented Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was heavier than the feather of Ma'at, it was rejected and then eaten by Ammit, the devourer of souls. And this is pretty much what we see here in this episode of Moon Knight. Later on in the episode, we see Arthur judge people's hearts. He explains that he has some of the power of Ammit. So it seems as if Ammit is judging people, but not when they're dead, when they're alive. More on this in a bit when we get to the scene. After the opening scene, the Marvel logo plays and we hear the song A Man Without Love, which is pretty reflective on how Stephen Grant feels in life. Stephen wakes up in bed and we see a shot of the Rubik's Cube that we see in a later on scene. We know he uses this as a puzzle to help him stay awake at night. Now, originally, when we first see this scene, we don't really know what's going on. He has a restraint on his leg, there's sand all around his bed, and there's tape on his door. Now, eventually we go on to find out when he's talking to his friend, the Golden Man, that his body at night just has to get up and walk about. He doesn't remember anything when this happens, which is why he tries to stay awake and which is why he puts these restraints on him so he doesn't actually go anywhere. This is also why he has the sand around his bed and the tape on his door. If he gets up and goes somewhere, he'll leave footprints in the sand and he'll know in the morning if he left or not. Also, the tape on the door will be broken so he'll know if he left his flat. So the first thing he does when he wakes up in the morning is check his restraint, check the sand, and check the door. After this, he feeds his fish who only has one fin, and notice there is a little statue of a pyramid inside of the fish tank. Perhaps this is something later, or perhaps it's just a decoration. He then calls his mom and leaves her voicemail. We hear him joke about taking his fish somewhere nice, but then we hear him say that he wakes up every morning feeling like he got hit by a bus. We don't know it at the time, but of course, eventually we find out that this is actually Marc Spector taking over his body and becoming Moon Knight, going around and getting in fights, which is why Steven's body hurts all the time. But of course, like he said, and like we go on to find out, he has zero recollection of this, so he doesn't actually know what's happening. Not yet, at least. We then follow Steven to work and we learn a little bit about him. We learn that he's a pretty passive guy, a nice guy who doesn't really want any confrontation, a guy that's tired all of the time because he tries to stay up at night because his body goes off and does whatever it wants. So we see him tired on the bus, falling asleep on top of strangers. We follow Steven to work and we find out that he works at a very famous London museum, the British Museum, in which right now they are doing an ancient Egypt showcase. And when he gets to work, we kind of see his knowledge about ancient Egypt. A little girl puts trash inside of a pyramid display, and Steven takes this opportunity to teach her a little bit about ancient Egypt. And this part is important, and it's related to the scale. He explains that if you take a hook and you put it down the nose, you pull it out, all the organs come out except for the heart, because the ancient Egyptians believed that they needed the heart to be judged in the underworld, and this is what I was talking about in the beginning. Anubis would judge them with their hearts on one side of the scale and the feather of Ma'at on another. If rejected, Ammit would eat their hearts. The little girl asks if it hurt being rejected, in which he says that doesn't make sense because he's alive, and we'll come back to this very specific point in just a bit. Now we find out that despite him having a vast amount of knowledge on ancient Egypt, he doesn't have a very good job at the museum, and a lot of people treat him like crap, calling him by the wrong name most of the time. However, a bit of good news happens. A female co-worker comes up to him and asks him if they're still on for steaks that night. Now Steven has no idea what she's talking about because as we go to find out, it's actually Mark who made that date, or perhaps another personality that's inside of him that hasn't been revealed yet. But regardless, it wasn't him that made the date, which is why he's so confused. And to top it all off, he's a vegan and they're going out for steaks. Now in the back, Steven is working with his boss who treats him like absolute crap, and even when he is showing how much knowledge he has on ancient Egypt, she still kind of refuses to listen and still rejects him being a tour guide, which just crushes his soul and is sad to watch. But he talks about the Ennead, and as Steven states, the Ennead has 9 members, not 7 like the posters show, but what's really interesting is that these 9 deities are grouped with the creation of our world. It kind of makes you think a little bit about the Infinity Stones. Maybe there's a connection here with gods. We'll have to wait and see. In fact, the Moon Knight comics actually talk about the Ennead. Now, the Ennead gods, the 9 gods in which Stephen Grant mentions here, are actual characters in Marvel Comics known as the Heliopolitans, and they exist in a place called Celestial Heliopolis, which is a city, and it's in an extra-dimensional realm. And in the comics, Khonshu is one of these Heliopolitans. Also, side note, Bast, the Black Panther god, is also a Heliopolitan as well, so there is a little bit of a Black Panther connection here. So I would not be surprised if we did see these Ennead gods in the future in the MCU. The next scene, we see Steven talking to his golden friend, where he explains that he's got a date with the girl from work, and he doesn't know how it happened because he didn't even ask her out. And of course we know it was Mark or another personality. He also states that if he is going to have a girlfriend one day, he can't be having ankle restraints on his bed. So he has to figure something out. Now from here we go back to Mark's flat and we see his nightly routine. His routine of trying to stay awake because, as we know, sometimes when he's asleep his body does what it wants. At least that's what he thinks it is, but it's really Mark getting up. As we mentioned before, he pours the sand around his bed, puts the tape on the door, grabs his Rubik's Cube, and puts on audio that helps him stay awake. From here we see what he does to stay awake, in which one big thing that he does is he actually studies Egyptian mythology. Specifically what he mentioned before, the Ennead, which says is a rift between God and man, which of course is setting up what is about to happen because he is about to hear the voice of Khonshu, the god of the moon, soon. Because the next scene that we see is of Steven lying on the grass. He gets up and the first thing he notices is that his jaw is super messed up, but he manages to put it back in place. His teeth are bloody, you can tell that he just fought. He asks what happened and he finds himself in the Alps having no idea how he got there, and then he hears a voice. The voice says, "Go back to sleep, worm." Steven looks around and sees no one, and then he hears the voice again saying, "You're not supposed to be here." Steven says that he agrees and continues to look for the voice but cannot find it. And here's where we hear the voice say, "Surrender the body to Mark," and Mark of course is Marc Spector. Now in the comics, Marc Spector is actually the true person, Moon Knight. Marc Spector is the main person and Stephen Grant is a personality of Marc Spector. More on who Mark is in just a bit. Now, Stephen has no idea what the voice is talking about when he says surrender the body. And we hear the voice call Stephen an idiot, saying the idiot is in control, meaning that Stephen right now is in control of the body and not Marc Spector. Now, the voice talking is the Egyptian moon god Khonshu. And in the comics, Marc Spector is the avatar for Khonshu. So basically, Marc Spector does the will of Khonshu. Now, Stephen then finds a scarab with Egyptian markings on it in his pocket. And we very briefly see the moon god Khonshu behind him. Now, Stephen senses his presence, but when he turns around, he's not there. He does, however, see some people in a window who start to fire at him, and then he runs away until he eventually finds himself in a city. He blends in with the crowd until we eventually meet Ethan Hawke's character, Arthur Harrow. Now, the people of this town worship Arthur, praising him and touching him as he goes by. He says it's a beautiful day and it feels like heaven, but it's not. Sometimes there's darkness hiding in people's hearts. And this is a direct call to the weighing of the hearts and the judgment that he is about to do. He asks who would like to be judged, and one person steps up and is deemed good. Another woman steps up and says, I must know. And we see that in this process, the cane moves back and forth, kind of like a scale would. Also, the scale on his hand shows us the end result. Green for good, red for bad. It was green for the first guy, deeming him good, but unfortunately, it shows up red for this lady, deeming her bad. Now here's where this gets kind of interesting, and this is a very important part. The lady says, I've been good my whole life, in which Arthur replies, I believe you. But the scales see everything, perhaps it's something that lies ahead. Meaning, she is going to go on to do something evil in the future, and Ammit is judging her now. Now, this is actually further explained by Arthur in the last part of this episode. When talking to Stephen in the museum, Stephen says, I don't have your beetle, in which Arthur replies, oh, the scarab, it doesn't belong to me, it belongs to Ammit. Do you know her? Now, it shows a picture of Ammit on the wall. Now, Ammit, in ancient Egyptian text and on this picture here, has the head of a crocodile, the front legs and torso of a lion, and the back legs and the rear end of a hippopotamus. These are the three largest man-eating animals known to ancient Egyptians. And Stephen even says here, Ammit, the first known boogeyman, in which Arthur replies, she was only a boogeyman for evildoers, and this is the important part. He says that she, Ammit, grew weary of waiting for sinners to have to commit their crimes before punishing them. He also says that she sees all of people's lives, their past, present, and future, meaning that she could see the sins that they will do in the future. So what is happening is that now, instead of Ammit judging people after they're dead, she is judging them while they're alive, using Arthur. But the plan is here to free her. In this scene where he judges the man who is deemed to be good, he says that he's brave, wanting to serve our goddess even before she wakes. Then when he's with Stephen in the museum at the end, he says, if Ammit had been free, she would have prevented Hitler and other horrible people and events. So this is what Arthur's plan is, to free Ammit so she can judge the world herself and not have to use him as what we presume is an avatar, because he goes on to talk about avatars, which we'll talk about in a bit. Now, after the lady dies, one of Arthur's men says that they had a problem with the exchange and they got ambushed, and that somebody came and killed two of their men, and that means they didn't get the scarab. But Arthur is very clever in this next scene. He asks if he's still there, in which he says, I believe so. So he calls out to the crowd, Dua Ammit. Now, in Arabic, the word dua means a prayer of invocation or a supplication or request or calling out to God. So when he says dua Ammit, in which we know Ammit is the goddess that he worships and he serves, so I assume that this phrase that he speaks is something like praise Ammit. And this immediately makes everybody fall to their knees. We assume to praise Ammit, but of course Stephen Grant here doesn't know what that means, so he is the last to get to his knees, which obviously shows that he is a person out of place, which means he is the person that ambushed Arthur's men. Really genius move here. Now, when Arthur sees him, he says, I know you, mercenary, in which Stephen Grant says, no, I'm not a mercenary. I work at a gift shop. Now, the mercenary is actually Marc Spector. That is what Marc Spector was. Before Marc Spector became Moon Knight, he was a mercenary, and he was on a job in Sudan where a fellow mercenary of his Bushmen killed an archaeologist in front of the archaeologist's daughter. He was appalled, and he fought Bushmen, but he lost. He's left for dead, but right before he dies, he finds himself before the statue of the Egyptian moon god Khonshu. He then actually dies, but is suddenly revived fully healed. He claims Khonshu resurrected him, wanting him to be the moon's knight and the left fist of Khonshu. However, a lot of people don't really know if Marc's telling the truth or if he's actually crazy and is making this up in his mind. But Marc Spector is a mercenary, and it seems like Marc Spector has run into Arthur before, which is why Arthur recognizes him. Unfortunately, Stephen Grant has no idea about any of this, and Arthur doesn't know that Mark/Stephen has dissociative identity disorder. So he thinks Stephen is really Marc, just kind of messing with him. But Arthur says, well, Stephen Grant of the gift shop, will you return the Scarab? And of course, Stephen is like, sure, yeah, I don't care. I don't even know what this is. I don't know how I'm here. So he tries to give it to him. But then we get a very Eddie Brock and Venom type of moment. And Khonshu even kind of sounds like Venom here, let's be honest. Stephen goes to give him the Scarab, but Khonshu takes control over his body and closes his hand. Stephen has no idea what is going on, is very confused, and he's trying to tell Arthur this. He's trying to tell him, I didn't do this. I have no control over my body right now. I'm trying to give it to you. Just take it. But here we can see kind of the power that Khonshu has over Stephen, and he may or may not have this power over Marc Spector. Marc Spector's mind might be a little bit more harder to break. Then again, they are kind of the same person, so who knows. So Khonshu won't let Stephen give Arthur the Scarab. So Arthur's men jump on him, but then Stephen's eyes kind of go into the back of his head, where he kind of falls asleep for a brief moment, wakes back up to see that he is really beating the crap out of these men. Just take a look at some of these guys on the floor. We can see blood coming out of their heads on the ground. This is kind of something we haven't really seen from Marvel. We haven't seen much blood coming out of people in Marvel. And Stephen's hand is holding the Scarab and is super bloody, and he has no idea what just happened because Marc briefly took over. Marc and Stephen are both fighting to use the body. So Stephen comes back, is super confused, and realizes what he did, and he needs to run. So he runs, and Khonshu says, don't you dare give up the Scarab. Stephen says okay. He gets in a van, starts to drive away. Now, of course, they all start to chase him, and Stephen is uttering, this has to be a dream. And from here, we get a pretty cool scene with a little questionable CGI at the end. But during the scene, every time it seems like Stephen is about to die, Marc Spector comes out. Now, we don't see what Marc Spector does, but we do see the aftermath when Stephen comes back each time. And each time we see that Marc has took care of business. Every time Marc comes out, he gets rid of some people. Until the very end where Stephen comes back and he's actually driving backwards. He also realizes that he has a gun in his hand in which he throws it at the car, in which Khonshu says, did he just throw the gun? So Khonshu is actively speaking to Marc during this whole entire thing. Stephen says, I don't know what I'm doing, so Khonshu says, well then leave us be. Of course, speaking about him and Marc. He manages to turn the car around, but then the car dies, in which two people get out of the car. They're about to go up to Stephen, but then the truck that was carrying the wooden logs at the top of the mountain, they finally reach the bottom and they kill the two guys. Marc then immediately wakes up in a panic, but then he looks around, sees that the restraint is still around his leg, and kind of laughs it off going, wow, that was actually just a dream, a very realistic dream. Now here's something very interesting. Stephen checks the normal things that he checks each morning, the sand and the door. And if you notice, the tape was still on the door. But clearly Marc Spector just did a lot of stuff. So this means that Marc knows exactly what Stephen does, and then he replaces it to make it seem like nothing ever happened at night when Marc is up and about. He redoes the tape as we see here because Stephen takes off the tape. Or is Marc Spector possibly not real? Could Khonshu and Marc Spector all be inside Stephen's head? This will be revealed in future episodes. Now Stephen's eating cereal, talking to his fish Gus, when he notices something very strange. He takes him to the pet store freaked out because Gus only had one fin in the beginning and now he magically has two. But he finds out that he was actually in the fish store yesterday buying a fish, in which Stephen has no recollection of at all, which means it was Marc. Now, what happened to the fish? I have no idea. It clearly died because Marc or another personality clearly had to go buy a new fish to replace Gus with. But unfortunately, Stephen doesn't have much time to talk about it as he realizes that he has a date. Or, at least, he had one. At the restaurant, it looks like he's getting stood up, so he calls the girl, in which she says that she was waiting for him on Friday, but it's now Sunday. She hangs up saying, lose my number, and Stephen still can't believe it. He asks the waiter what day it is, and he confirms it is Sunday. Now, Stephen is super upset at this point, and you just feel so bad for him. He's so upset that he even orders a steak, despite the fact that he's a vegan, and he has no idea how to order order a steak. The waiter asks him what kind of cut he wants. He says the best part. He asks him how he wants it done. He tells him good. You just feel so bad for the guy. And you feel even worse in the next scene where you see that he brought flowers, he has heart candies, and he's on the phone with his mom, and he's lying to her, telling her that the date went well and that he thinks his mom would really like her and he'll bring her around soon. Now back at Steven's flat, he's super down. He's eating the chocolates that he bought for the girl. He gives Gus the fish a few of the sprinkles from the chocolates, but then he drops them and he notices some markings on the floor. He notices that it looks like the table has been scooted over and back over several times to leave these marks on the floor. So he lifts up the rug, he sees more markings, so he investigates. He moves the table over to where it looks like it's always been moved to, and he finds a secret compartment that has a phone in it with a charger and a key to something. He charges the phone, turns it on, and sees that he has a ton of missed calls from somebody named Layla. Now all of the calls are from Layla except for number 32. You see the name Duchamp, and this is very important because this is Jean-Paul Duchamp. Jean-Paul Duchamp was a French soldier and pilot, and he was a mercenary, and while he was a mercenary, he actually befriended Marc Spector. The two of them became close friends, and Marc ended up calling Jean-Paul Frenchie. Frenchie was actually with Marc in Sudan where he tried to attack Bushmen and failed and almost died. Well, he did die, and then Khonshu revived him. Eventually, Marc and Frenchie run into each other again, and Frenchie is shocked to see Marc alive. And from there on out, he helps Marc with his Moon Knight operations. He is basically, if Moon Knight is Batman, Alfred. He's Moon Knight's Alfred. So I'm assuming we'll see Jean-Paul Duchamp probably pop up pretty soon. Now, as he's about to call Layla, she actually calls him. He picks up and we find out that Layla has been texting and calling him for months, not knowing if he was alive. Of course, he has no idea who she is, so she's very confused and she says, "What is going on with you, Marc?" And this really shocks Steven and he asks, "Why did you call me Marc?" She eventually hangs up and he tries to call her back, but then he hears a different voice than Khonshu. A voice calling out Steven. He looks around, calls out hello, but there's no one in sight, in which the voice continues to say, "Steven, you need to stop. You're gonna get yourself in trouble." But Steven doesn't believe this and he says someone's having a laugh, meaning someone's kind of playing a prank on him. But he traces the voice to the bathroom, in which he looks in the mirror, gets scared for a second, but realizes that he's just looking at his reflection. However, as he keeps staring into it, the reflection starts to shake its head no. And since Steven isn't shaking his head, this obviously is of major concern, so he turns the light on, in which just a normal reflection is revealed. But the lights in the apartment start to flicker, and then he turns around, but his reflection does not turn around. It continues to stare at him. And then it calls to him, and it says, "Steven," in which Steven turns around, and he says, "Stop looking." Now this is Marc Spector. Marc is telling Steven to stop looking into the affairs of Marc. Then the entire flat starts to shake like it's an earthquake. Books and items are falling off the shelves, everything's moving, and Steven runs out of the flat and he runs to the elevator. Now Steven in the elevator turns around, looks in the mirror, and he kind of checks out his own reflection. He touches it to make sure he's not going crazy. The elevator opens up to the 3rd floor. Steven kind of stares down the hall and then he hits the G for ground button in the elevator. But then the elevator opens up again on floor 2, and Steven looks down the hall and then Khonshu appears. He fades in and out until eventually he gets right up to the elevator, in which right when he gets to the elevator, it's actually revealed to be an old woman. But Steven is terrified and he falls to the floor and he freaks the woman out. Even though he says, "Oh, I've lost a contact," she is still super freaked out and kind of threatened by him. Now the elevator opens back up on the 5th floor, in which Steven is really concerned about what is going on. But then he turns around and Khonshu is right behind him, but then he wakes up and he's on the bus. And here's where stuff really starts to go down. He's on the bus and he looks out and he sees Khonshu just on the street. He then gets off the bus and then he sees that Arthur was on the bus. And this is where Steven really starts to freak out. He goes in, he tells the security guard, "Can you not let anybody dodgy in?" His boss comes in asking to take some stuff downstairs, and he actually stands up to her and says, "Can you just give me a minute?" Because he spotted somebody that was on the bus. So he goes and he follows that person, and eventually that person leads him to Arthur. Now Arthur is kind of starting to realize something is up, and this isn't the same person, the same mercenary that he ran into before. He says, "So you really do work at a gift shop?" Steven runs over to a security guard named Ronnie, says, "Ronnie, can you help me?" In which Ronnie pulls up his sleeve and reveals a scale, saying, "Praise Ammit," revealing that he works with Arthur. And this is what we talked about before, where Arthur is serving Ammit. She is not yet free, but in the meantime, through him, she is judging people before they actually die. Steven tries to run away, but he keeps running into more and more people that are with Arthur. And then we find out that Arthur actually knows Khonshu is inside of Stephen's head. He mentions the voice in his head and how it's relentless and forever unsatisfied. And eventually Arthur gets him and he says, "I'm trying to help you," and he starts to judge him. But here's what's very interesting. The scale doesn't go green or red, not good nor bad, but instead Arthur looks at him and says, "There is chaos in you." Now this could mean several different things, which I'm sure they'll reveal, but I'm thinking that the chaos is definitely all of the different personalities inside of him. Now he gets lucky and a Tor comes in and he manages to escape. Now this seems to be very shocking to Arthur, and Arthur actually tells everybody to let him go. Now this is of course because he has a plan. Stephen has to work inventory because he was late a few times during the week, and this is where Arthur is going to strike. Stephen is about to leave, but he thinks he hears a dog, so he goes searching for it. Now as he starts to search for this, what he assumes is a dog, we can see in the reflections of the glass Marc Spector, and he realizes what's happening here. Now he eventually runs into the dog, but then we see the shadow of it and he realizes really fast that this is not a dog. It's something way bigger and a lot more monstrous. He starts to hide, but then he hears over the intercom Arthur saying, "Stephen Grant of the gift shop, give me the scarab and you won't be torn apart." Stephen throws his bag in an attempt to distract what we thought originally was going to be Werewolf by Night. We were wrong, it's actually an Egyptian jackal. It jumps at the bag, but then Stephen runs and it eventually starts chasing him. It jumps on him, hurts his arm just a little bit, but eventually Stephen runs into the bathroom, and here is the first time where we meet Marc Spector. Once inside the bathroom, Marc calls out to Stephen from the mirror. He says, "Stephen, I can save us, but you can't fight me this time. I need full control," speaking about the body. Now Stephen thinks he's going crazy. He ignores his moving reflection that is speaking to him and he starts to slap himself, and then he says he's gonna die. Now eventually, Marc says, "Look at me," and Stephen does. He tells him he's not going to die. "Let me save us." And if you notice, there is no longer a reflection of Stephen in the mirrors, in any of the mirrors, because it's kind of creating like an infinite mirror here. The reflection is gone and it's just Marc that he sees in the mirror. Marc says, "Let me save us," and Stephen finally gives in. And as Stephen starts to agree and Marc starts to take over, you can see Egyptian markings and hieroglyphics in the background kind of start to light up. Stephen shakes his head yes, and all of a sudden the reflection of Marc is gone. It's back to the reflections of Stephen, or now I should say Marc, and Moon Knight comes out. Right as the Moon Knight transformation begins, the Egyptian jackal jumps in and attacks him. However, the next thing that we see is the Egyptian jackal trying to get away, showing you just how strong Moon Knight is. And in this last scene, we can see Moon Knight does not hold his punches, and Marvel is going to show us him not holding his punches. And the episode ends with our first full look at Moon Knight. Not that we didn't see it in the trailer, but it's first revealed in this episode. So, what did you think about the very first episode of Moon Knight? I thought it was a great episode, and I'm super excited to see how this all ends. So let me know what you think in the comments down below about the first episode of Moon Knight. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future Moon Knight videos. For live updates, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter. And as always, thank you all so much for watching. Woof woof.